Ladies and gentlemen, this is too far away from me. I don't know why. How are you doing this afternoon? Are you good? Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Nobuhle Hlongwa. I'm the Dean and the head of the School of Arts here in the College of Humanities, and we are very privileged today to have Prof. Perry, who will be giving us a lecture. And I think maybe before I call on Prof. Perry to present his lecture, I do want to say that as the University of KwaZulu-Natal, in terms of our strategic plan, UKZN has a new strategic plan, which is a 10-year plan, a 2023-2032 plan. Internationalization is one of our key goals as the institution. And as a School of Arts, in terms of our plan for internationalization, we want to increase our international mobility of students and staff. Internationally, and when I talk internationally, I mean also within the wider African continent. So we want to increase our footprints there, and as a school we have identified key disciplines that, like, through those disciplines we will be engaging internationally. And English is one of those disciplines that we have identified as key for us to interact with the world, to interact with the rest of Africa. In addition to English, we have music. We also have French, which is one of our international language, where we are doing very well in terms of our strategic partnership. We have Kiswahili, we have isiZulu. We're doing very well as UKZN, comparing with all the other 26 universities in South Africa. When it comes to the intellectualization of isiZulu and how we are implementing our language policy as UKZN, we are leading. We are one of the leading institutions in South Africa. So, and we want to extend that internationally, as there are so many universities already that are offering isiZulu. And drama as well. We have also identified drama as our key discipline, where we really want to extend our footprint internationally. So currently there are some various international partnerships that we have, starting with the University of Denver, where Prof. Perry is coming from. UKZN has Denver as one of the universities where we have partnerships. As a School of Arts, we do also have various partnerships. I'll just list one important one, which is a recent one with the University of Antwerp in Belgium. This is a partnership that we have entered to through the digital arts. That's the other, I think I didn't mention digital arts. Yes, I didn't. That's the other key discipline for our School of Arts. So we do have that relationship, and we have entered into that relationship also through our working or collaborative work with the Center for Creative Arts. That is also doing excellent work in terms of internationalization and also community engagement. So we also want to work very close with ACALAN and the African Union in our goals and also in fulfilling our mission as the University of KwaZulu-Natal to be a premier university of African scholarship. So I just wanted to just say those few words before I introduce Prof. Perry to you. I just want to make sure that like my eyes are going to be able to read this short bio for Prof. Perry. Prof. Perry is a professor at the University of Denver. He has received, his PhD in English in medieval studies with designated emphasis in critical theory from the University of California, Berkeley. Before that, he received an MA in English from the University of Georgia, as well as BA in English and philosophy from the same institution. He specializes in late medieval and early modern English and French literature, as well as some Italian and also Latin literature. So there is a widespread in terms of Prof. Perry's focus areas. So I think the late sentence there relates to the medieval and the early modern Christianity, as well as the critical theory and the history of philosophy. So when you hear the spread, like you can see that like other than Prof. Perry being maybe linked to English, but like there is philosophy. There is philosophy there, there is a little bit of Christianity there, so which means our working with Prof. Perry will cut across our different schools like your RPC, and I see my colleague from RPC sitting there, and thank you very much, colleagues. And at this stage now, let me invite Prof. Perry to present his lecture, and let's give him a big round of applause. Thank you very much.
Y'all don't need to see my email. Where's the other PowerPoint? Here we go. Yeah, great. Thank you to Prof. Shishlanga for having me here, as well as Professor Mkhize for making this exchange possible. And also thank you to my colleagues in English, Jean, Beverly, Nadia, Natasha, Pindello, and as well as Jethro, who's going to be responding to this for making this day pleasant. As well as thank you to my honor students who have also been attentive and patient listeners as I ask them to do that one more time. So I've been teaching primarily the philosophical side of what I do, although the literature and philosophy aren't totally divorced. This will be a little bit more on the other side of things, on the literature side of things, though the philosophy will run throughout, I think you will be able to see, and there is a good bit of Christianity here as well. I should say this is very early work for what will be my third book, I believe. So I'm hoping that it coalesces into a book, we'll see. So here we go. I will not start with the Middle Ages, though. The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest fear is fear of the unknown. So begins H.P. Lovecraft's essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature. And I want to begin there too, because Lovecraft's judgment is found bandied about all over the place, from scholarly works where it sometimes serves as an epigraph, like here, to works of popular culture. It is so ubiquitous that it has taken on something like axiomatic status and criticism of the horror genre. Trotted out, stripped of its context, the rest of the essay is hardly ever cited, let alone the considerations of the cultural milieu that produced such a statement, and used as a kind of self-justifying proposition. It's a good place for me to start this talk, though, because I think it's wrong, or at least partially wrong. The fact that it gets mentioned so often means that probably a lot of people are afraid of the unknown. In any case, taking aim at it usefully reveals just how much can be gained by broadening our considerations of horror to include, if not our oldest fears, then at least pretty old ones from the Middle Ages, and to think through what they might mean, not just in terms of what scared medieval people. And so that's what I'll be up to today, exploring an instance of medieval horror, both as a useful heuristic to think through the medieval as such, and in order to use the Middle Ages as a vantage point from which to critique modernity, exposing some of its fundamental assumptions, even those that keep modernity separate from the Middle Ages. Specifically, I'll be thinking about horror as a mode and certain forms of figuration used in the Cloud of Unknowing, an anonymously authored Middle English mystical text from the late 14th century. I'll work through what these figurations reveal to us about the way this Lovecraftian association of horror with knowledge works in a very different context and to very different ends than our own, ultimately suggesting that fear of the unknown indexes an effective response to an epistemological crisis that plagues modernity, whereas in the Middle Ages, it is what is known, even known most intimately, that can be a real storehouse of horror. Let me start, though, with the first term of my title, medieval horror, and what I mean by the fact that I want to think of it less as a genre and more of a mode. I should note that in discussing medieval horror in this way, I'm working against several scholarly assumptions. The first assumption is that there is no such thing as medieval horror. If one looks at classical or popular histories of the genre, or even more recent surveys, one finds time and again the notion that horror is a modern invention. Medievalists have been influential in the field. The term final girl, which is quite popular, after all was coined by a scholar of medieval Norse literature, Carol Clover, and Jeffrey Jerome Cohen's monster thesis has even proven influential in discussions. And medievalists have contested this periodization, but our colleagues have not quite taken our quibbles to heart. Most accounts of the history of horror view it as an outgrowth of the Gothic. More specifically, if they want to name a single point of origin, scholarly accounts tend to hail Horace Walpole's The Castle of Otranto from 1764 as the first full-fledged example of the genre, though popular accounts sometimes bestow that honor on Mary Shelley's Frankenstein from 1818. The understanding of horror as a distinct genre from the Gothic can in fact be traced back to contemporary accounts with these moments, especially Anne Radcliffe's On the Supernatural and Poetry from 1826, an essay and dialogue that begins with its characters musing on the ruins of Kenilworth Castle, which is that. Radcliffe attempts to aesthetically justify the Gothic as the purveyor of the heightened and refined literary quality of quote-unquote terror, as opposed to the base and artless shock of horror. Radcliffean Gothic also prefers natural explanations for supernatural elements, a kind of forerunner to the revelations of Scooby-Doo. It was the creepy groundskeeper, after all, who was scaring all those teenagers away. Our own sensibilities have shifted somewhat, but nevertheless, the afterlife of Radcliffe's essay has involved a denigration of the horror genre. Indeed, its categorization in that amorphous contemporary designation of genre fiction, which likewise includes sci-fi and fantasy, and which can further explain, at least in part, why there is such more robust scholarly literature on horror in the world of film criticism. I have no real interest in policing the genre divisions between horror and the Gothic, and I'll be concerned with different affective productions than Radcliffe's. But I think this potted history does tell us something about why the medieval tends to be set aside in this discussion. That is, it reveals to us further assumptions that undergird this denial of medieval horror. The Gothic famously relies on a rejected and even abjected medieval past. Walpole prefaces The Castle of Otranto by claiming that it is based on a medieval Italian manuscript, purely fictional. Radcliffe's own Mysteries of Udolpho is set in a medieval fortress, gloomy and foreboding, of course, and the first of many to come. and there's no need to produce endless examples. My point is that the Gothic derives its energies, its capacities to terrify or horrify, at least in part from the outrage occasioned by the persistence of the medieval into modernity, a return of the repressed or never fully suppressed or surpassed that threatens to undo the neat rationality of modern life. That, then, is the first subsidiary assumption, the familiar periodizing one that the medieval has no place in modernity, an assumption that medievalists, myself included, have all done a great deal to dismantle over the years. In this context, though, the assumption is closely linked to another, less familiar one that still has widespread acceptance, namely that the medieval produces feelings associated with horror and modernity because, from the vantage point of modernity, the Middle Ages as such are horrific. We see this in everything from the comedic vision of, from the comedic vision of Monty Python there on the right, where everyone but the king is covered in shit, where a knight keeps losing limbs and wanting to fight, to the anxiety-inducing and disgust-provoking depiction of medieval life in Alexis Guermon's Hard to Be a God over there on the left, a very unpleasant movie, a great but unpleasant movie. To the casual way, the worst aspects of modernity are relegated to quote-unquote medieval barbarism. There is yet another related assumption here. Because the Middle Ages as such are horrific, they cannot have a distinguishable genre of horror. They are steeped in horror, so they do not have the capacity to distinguish it as a mode of representation from anything else. How would the Middle Ages represent horror, so the argument goes? Wouldn't it just be realism for them? Before I get to what medieval horror actually looks like, though, I want to briefly discuss one final assumption that I will be challenging, that horror is a genre classified primarily by content, which means more than anything else, plot and character. Instead, I want to think through horror as possessing certain formal characteristics that can be deployed in a variety of contexts. In the end, thinking of horror less as a historical genre that meets certain kinds of criteria and more like a trans-historical mode, capable of being strategically extended into different sorts of texts in order to produce certain kinds of feelings or knowledge. Approaching horror in this way runs against the grain of most treatments of it, even sophisticated ones and ones by medievalists. Take Noel Coward's still foundational philosophy of horror. He defines the genre as one that produces an agitated response to the presence of a monster that has the potential to be real and is both threatening and impure, and so makes us want to, quote, avoid the touch of it. A nice bit of understatement there. Cohen's monster culture essay is less rigid in its definitions. The monster, quote, refuses easy categorization, end quote. But it too specifically and overtly deals with a physical monster of some sort, even if that body is both, quote, an embodiment of a certain cultural moment and, quote, is difference made flesh. I'm not going to reify a distinction between content and form, nor would it make any sense to do so here. There are plenty of monsters in the Middle Ages. There's a bunch on the screen tormenting St. Anthony, including that little lobster guy in the left-hand corner. And I'll be discussing a demon and a demon's body in a little bit. But focusing more on the formal qualities of horror allows me to undermine some of the assumptions just covered, especially the periodizing ones, obviating their force by showing that horror can be thought of as an effect of the text that produces certain sorts of conceptual and affective responses. So, dealing with a literary mode then means I'm going to be assessing the way that horror is rendered in specific circumstances, and in particular text. So let me turn now to the work from which I'll be drawing my example of medieval horror, The Cloud of Unknowing. Now, depending on what circles you run in, this is a well-known text. Medievalists love it, as do people who are into mysticism, either of the scholarly or New Agey kind. Although for this latter group, it's not as famous as like Julian of Norwich, who comes about a generation after. For most people in humanities departments, even English departments, though it's fairly obscure, I'm not talking about Chaucer here, so a bit of introduction is in order. As I said, the Cloud is an anonymous prose text of the latter half of the 14th century. When discussing its composer, we refer to him as the Cloud author, so that's what I'll be using throughout. While we don't know the author, we do know some things about the text's origins, like where it was written, which was most likely here. Beauvais Priory, a Carthusian charter house. And charter house is the specific term for a Carthusian priory. If you know about the Carthusians, this tells us a good bit. Carthusian monasticism is an extreme form of asceticism, the most intense option institutionally available through the Catholic Church. That is something you can institutionally practice, not as like a lone hermit in the woods. It's most popularly known today from the documentary Into Great Silence. The charter house consists of what are known as choir monks, who are the extreme ascetics, and then so-called lay brothers, who are also monks but spend less time in ascetic devotion and more time in manual labor, making the running of the charter house possible. The Carthusian choir monks live in individual cells along a long hallway. The cells are large, though incredibly sparse, with an attached workshop. They too have to do some manual labor, and a small walled garden so that they might grow their own vegetables. They all have to be vegetarians. For the most part, food, dishes, and the finished products of their labor are passed in and out of the cell through a revolving compartment that shields the monk from having to interact or even see the lay brother who is delivering food or taking away the products of the monk's labor. If some communication is needed because they take a vow of silence, that is accomplished by passing notes back and forth through this revolving compartment. They leave their cells 3 times a day for Mass and prayers. And the vast majority of the monk's time is spent in silent meditation, prayer, study, and writing. Once a week for an hour, they can take communal walks in the countryside during which they may speak about issues that concern the community. But that's it. It's intense stuff. Note, though, that I said that the monks may spend time writing, and that is where the Cloud comes from. So what you have on the screen here is the beginning of the Cloud and what is probably its best surviving copy. It is not produced at Beauvais, but at a charter house of the Assumption of St. Mary, Mount Grace, East Harley, Yorkshire, so a little over 100 miles away at a different Carthusian priory. And that's significant. In some sense, it seems like the Cloud achieved a certain kind of popularity. It survives in 17 manuscripts. To put that in perspective, far and away the most popular work in the English Middle Ages, Chaucer, survives in 81 manuscripts. Much else, far, far fewer. The Green Knight, for instance, 1 manuscript. However, the conditions of production and circulation of the Cloud probably skews that perception. Carthusians, after all, defined the writing of books as a kind of manual labor, one, moreover, not distantly related to prayer. It was labor that was spiritually improving. They produced a great number of books then, and much of what survives in relation to English mysticism is a product of these charter houses, including the only medieval copy of the Book of Margery Kempe, the first autobiography in the English language, and the English translation of the supposedly heretical Mirror of Simple Souls by Marguerite Perret. These 2 examples come from Mount Grace alone, the same place that produced this book. Producing a large number of books for a community that is not going to circulate them widely is one way of ensuring the survival of that material. And these works are not meant to be circulated. In fact, we are not supposed to be reading or talking about the Cloud of Unknowing. So throughout, I'll put the Middle English, and sorry, there's some big blocks that you may not be able to see well. I'll put the Middle English up there, but I'll work through it in modern English. In the prologue, the Cloud author addresses first, whoever you are that shall have this book in your possession, and he means that materially and broadly. He's speaking to whoever is holding the book, whether as property or on loan or by bearing as a messenger or some other form of borrowing. This person, including us, as we will see in a moment, should neither, quote, read it, speak it out, write it down, or suffer that it should be read, written, or spoken of to anyone, except those that have a true will and a whole intent to become, quote, a perfect follower of Christ. What that means is further clarified. A perfect follower is one that does not only participate in active living, but also, and more especially, in the sovereigntist, that is the highest and best, point of contemplative living. That person's purpose is demonstrated both by the fact that you know they've been thinking about this for a long time and by the fact that they already have a virtuous sort of active life. The book is designed to help that kind of person in this present life to come to be a perfect soul, even if they still live in this deadly body, a mortal body. For anyone else, it's not going to help. It accordeth nothing. In fact, he goes on to say in the next paragraph, it might even lead that person to error, that is, to heretical belief. And such a warning is necessary because, as it will turn out, the Cloud is a sort of manual on how to live an extreme ascetic life of contemplation that can characterize that of a Carthusian monk. Can characterize because it doesn't necessarily do so. The Cloud of Author will later distinguish further different forms of living, and he's already done so, this active life versus contemplative life. He later discusses those using the figures of Martha and Mary and their different forms of attending on Christ in the Gospel of Luke. Martha rushes around to make sure Jesus is comfortable and well fed, while Mary listens to the wisdom at his feet. The Cloud Author will tell us that Martha's active life is a good one, and indeed it is the life that most of us have to lead. But Mary's is better, the higher calling of the contemplative life. The prologue has already specified that he is writing for the contemplative, but as we move into the text itself, he further divides the contemplative life. As he begins the work, the Cloud Author talks about 4 forms of living: the common, which is the active life, and then 3 kinds of monastic life: the special, the singular, and the perfect. The special life basically corresponds to the lay brothers who care for the Carthusian choir monks, a life of service and the needs of those with even higher callings. In differentiating the singular from the perfect, then, the Cloud Author explains that God's recognition of a person's love of God has pulled them deeper into contemplative living until they achieve the singular life. And from the solitary form and manner of living of that life, then, the contemplative may learn to lift up the foot of their love and step toward the state and degree of living that is perfect, the last state of all. The already extreme asceticism of the life of the Carthusian choir monk, then, is not the greatest form of contemplative living, but is a stepping stone from which that form might be reached. A few subsequent points follow from this. The Cloud is not a monastic rule that enjoins further asceticism. Indeed, how much more ascetic can we get? But instead is a guide to meditation that is meant to further enhance that life. That is, if the monastic rule tells Carthusians what to do with their bodies, that they can lead a singular life, the Cloud helps their souls achieve a perfect one. It documents mystical practice, an ecstatic union with the divine. One should note here that what is at issue is the experience of the perfect life. Then you need a guide that has had that experience himself. If few people have had this very special experience, then only someone who has had that can help you achieve it yourself. The Cloud, then, is written by an expert on mystical contemplation that is teaching a younger Carthusian choir monk how to achieve that same experience. Thus, throughout, the author refers to the reader as ghostly friend, a friend of the spirit. The text is being written and imagines being consumed within the cloister walls of a Carthusian charter house for those who want to move from an already ascetic life to an even more ascetic life of the spirit. The reason we might think of this as a kind of asceticism of the spirit is that the kind of mysticism that the Cloud instructs is what is known as apophatic. And a quick discussion of the Cloud Author's forebears clarifies what that is. Christian mysticism, especially in the Latin Church, tends to draw its authoritative status and a good deal of inspiration from St. Augustine's account of his final conversion, a conversation he had with his mother Monica in the Garden of Ostia, a moment that ends in an ecstatic vision of the divine and his conversion. I won't read this whole thing, but a lot can be gleaned from just the first line. If to any man the tumult of the flesh grew silent, silent the images of earth and sea and air, and if the heavens grew silent, and the very soul grew silent to herself, and by not thinking of self mounted beyond self, and so on. We already have here the basics of mystical praxis, imagining different categories of things becoming silent, including your own desires and soul, so that you can transcend the self. Augustine goes on to catalog further what must fade: dreams, visions, language, so that we can hear the voice of God, and not through any medium in which we are told in the scriptures he speaks to individuals, not via angels or thunders or parables, but God in propria persona. This experience occurs in a flash which ravishes and absorbs the individual, wrapping them in the inward joys of the Lord. The mystical practice that gets further developed out of this distinguishes between these different modes: the recitation of the splendors of the world and the qualities of the divine. This is what's known as the cataphatic. And then their negation, an emptying out of experience and the mystic's very soul, so that he or she might experience the divine, the apophatic. This codification of cataphatic enumeration and apophatic negation is first robustly theorized in the work of a writer we now call Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. One of those moments where you trot out a name as a medievalist and people are like, what? Who we now think was a Syrian monk from around the 6th century, but whom the Middle Ages mistook for the Dionysius, St. Paul's first converts from the Acts of the Apostles, and so a figure of immense authority. The Cloud author is intimately familiar with his works, usually referring to him by the common late medieval name, which is just Dennis. And even translating one of his works, The Mystical Theology, into English as Dennis Hid Divinity, the first translation of that work into any vernacular language, any language outside of Latin. In works like that one, or in his Divine Names, the Pseudo-Dionysius advises that you think of all the names and qualities associated with the divine, light, goodness, etc., as the first step of cataphatic practice, and then because God is greater than light, more than good, transcending any possible quality that can be ascribed to him and exceeding language's capacity to signify, you then apophatically negate all of these terms. In apophatic mysticism, our capacity to imagine and to understand are both proven to be insufficient for the divine, and so must be left behind for a stillness and silence that characterize your innermost being, that is stiller than stillness and quieter than silent, which is where the divine is to be found. And so there's the schematic for you all. That apophatic practice, too, is what the Cloud author recommends. And as you might imagine, it has a tense relationship with the literary impulse towards figuration. And so I want to look at two figures from the Cloud to see how the author handles them and how in one he produces an instance of medieval horror. The first figure I want to talk about, though, is an obvious one, which is the titular cloud. We meet it early in the text in the 3rd chapter of 75, a short chapter covering, as the author's own table of contents tells us, how the work of this book shall be wrought and the worthiness of it before all other works. That chapter opens by telling the ghostly friend to, quote, lift up thy heart to God with a meek stirring of love, and only to God, none of his goods. The reader is told to think only on him, so that nothing in thy wit or in thy will, but only himself. We are to forget all of God's creatures and all of their works, so that we do not think about nor desire any of them. The Cloud author assures us that this is the work of the soul that most pleases God, and that it is, moreover, the work of the souls in purgatory themselves. In fact, you yourself are cleansed and made virtuous by this work. It's the lightest work of all if you are helped by grace, but if not, quote, it is hard and wonderful for you to do. Because of this potential difficulty, the Cloud author pauses for encouragement and to give the initiate a better sense of what all this looks like. And here's where we find the figure of the cloud. Don't let up, the Cloud author advises, but travail in that state until you feel list, a word that means specifically listen, but here metaphorically extended to encompass a kind of receptivity. As you begin, you find nothing but a darkness, and as it were, a cloud of unknowing. You certainly never knew what, saving that you feel in your will a naked intent toward God. Intent is both will and attention, and naked because it is without images. And that is my point here. The cloud is emphatically associated with darkness, but otherwise left vague. This darkness in this cloud is whatever you do between you and your God, preventing you from seeing him. Quote, by the light of understanding in your reason, nor feel him in the sweetness of your love and your affection. You are told to abide in this darkness as long as you can, because if you are ever to feel or to see God, it will be here. And so it behooves you to always be in this darkness and in this cloud, he says. And if you busily work on remaining in this darkness and this cloud, you will eventually come into his mercy. That is, you will have an experience of the divine. So the cloud is an interesting figure for this author to use as his central conceit. It likely derives from this moment in Exodus, where the Lord calls to Moses from a cloud covering Mount Sinai. But it also has quotidian pertinence. We see clouds all the time, yet they are hard to describe, amorphous and shifting. We've invented categories for them, stratus, cumulus, cirrus, but they move and blend into one another, cirrocumulus. And if their taxonomy is difficult, so is our capacity to hold them in the imagination, which is further denied to us in this work by the emphatic and insistent association of the cloud only with darkness. The descriptors in this passage that are associated with other things will not get you to the divine, the light of understanding, or the sweetness of love, or that simply describe the difficulty of remaining in the cloud of unknowing. You have to busily work at it because the mind does tend to produce images. Naked intent is a difficult state in which to remain. You'll note, too, that despite the fact that mysticism is sometimes characterized as an emotional tie to the divine that succeeds where reason fails, the cloud author denies the efficacy of both the understanding and affect. The cloud of unknowing is complete darkness, complete negation, true apophasis. But the cloud is not the only figurative construct we find in the work, and I think it's useful to contrast it with another one, a much more vivid figure. We might read chapter 55 as one of the cloud author's digressions. It concerns how those that, quote, follow the fervor of spirit and reproving sins without discretion are deceived. Discretion, though, is rightfully important to the cloud author's project because it has a specialized meaning in the context of divine images and meditation. It is more commonly discussed under the rubric of discretion of spirits. And basically, it addresses the problem of how one knows whether the things one experiences in meditation on the divine are indeed something divinely inspired or sent to one from a more demonic source. The cloud author, then, is tackling a pertinent issue in this chapter, but he makes it seem digressive by blending the issue of discretion with the problem of approval. That is, critiquing with others without concomitant humbleness in one's own position. He begins that chapter by announcing that he will explain how, quote, the fiend will deceive some men in the following manner, and then goes on to say that the fiend will, quote, inflame their brains to maintain God's laws in a way that overdoes it, that isn't discreet in the way we normally mean it now, and that is a particularly effective deception on the devil's part because it doesn't simply tempt men with evil. And moreover, it is particularly tempting within a context of a monastic community with such particular strictures as the Carthusian. The devil inspires them, the cloud author says, to be, quote, like busy prelates, watching over all degrees of Christian men's living as an abbot over his monks. These people will tell you that they have been stirred to action by the fire of charity, but they lie, says the cloud author, as they are instead acting out due to the, quote, the fire of hell welling in their brains and in their imagination. The seeming digression is subsequently proven by a further one, namely, can the devil take on bodily shape? Yes, he can. Just as we see angels in the Old Testament take on bodily likeness to minister God's wishes, the devil, who has no more body in his own being than angels have, can take on bodily shape to make his ministrations. More and importantly, just as the angelic form has some relation to God's message, so too does the demonic form. He will, quote, figure in some quality of his body what his servants are in spirit. And we know this from, quote, the discipline of necromancy, which is defined here as the science of making legalistic pleas to wicked spirits. To some of these necromancers, the fiend has appeared, And when he does, he takes on a specific bodily form. Evermore, he has but one nostril, and that is great and wide, and he will gladly cast it up so that a man may see through it up into the brain in his head, the which brain is nothing other than the fire of hell, for the fiend may have no other brain. Just so you know. And anyone who looks up into that hellfire brain will lose their wits forever. Briefly, I want to point out that the Cloud author does draw these digressions back around to his point. The devil figures bodily here what his followers are in spirit because, quote, he inflames so the imagination of his contemplatives with the fire of hell, so they suddenly, without discretion, the discretion of spirits kind, shut out their curious conceits, and without any advisement, take it on themselves to blame others' faults over soon. They only have one nostril spiritually, rather than the septum that divides the nostril into two, and that is a figure of making distinctions between good and evil, evil from worse, good from better, and so on. I think that one can see, too, that the digressions are not really that what the Cloud author is positing here is the contemplative, rather than persisting in the cloud of unknowing, will have their imaginations run wild about the perceived sins and wickedness of others, which will then cause them to act as spiritual busybodies, rather than practicing contemplation and negation that drives the self beyond self. So if the image of the cloud of unknowing, purposefully vague and without further elaboration, as an image that isn't one, is our guiding figure and principle, the figure of the devil with one nostril is its opposite. It's what happens when you don't persist in the cloud of unknowing, but instead let your imagination run wild with different things. The vividness of the devil with one nostril, then, is part of the point. If the cloud cannot be described, because to do so would defeat the purpose, the devil with one nostril must be described memorably, because the imagination will produce such lively images outside of the cloud of unknowing in any case. The devil with one nostril and his hellfire brain, in other words, is figured in such a way as to stick in your brain, to be a potent reminder of what happens when you let your imagination run away from you, fill up your consciousness with your own conceits, rather than persist in the imageless and selfless meditation that you should be practicing. As a way to begin drawing all this to a close, I want to spend a little bit more time with the devil with one nostril, fun guy, to talk about how the figure works and of what its vividness consists. If the cloud is a figure that both evokes biblical authority and quotidian experience, then so too does the devil with one nostril, and it does so at the same time. The cloud from Exodus is not the same as the clouds we see every day. Indeed, when Moses enters the cloud, to the Israelites it looks like fire. We are asked to extend our worldly experience of clouds to encompass this very special cloud that looks like fire, out of which the Lord calls to Moses. The devil with one nostril is slightly different. The bodily likeness seems to be an implicitly human body, humanish, with one big exception, and that's the one big nostril, through which one can peer right up into the hellfire brain. That is both an image of how our bodies work and one that violates our own experience of our bodies. To state the obvious, we mostly have two nostrils, and you cannot see into our brains from them, though it's one way to get to the brain. It's a slight perversion of the human body, then, made all the more upsetting because it is slight. But this violation of the quotidian body is at the same time a violation of the divine. After all, as Genesis tells us, the human body is made in the image of the Lord. The difference from the divine image, too, is meant to be all the more upsetting because it is minor. We might recall that one of the few moments in hell that drives Dante to weep is not any number of the truly gruesome sights that he sees, but the false prophets, who are otherwise intact except their heads are turned around, so that they face their back, and they cry so that tears run down the cleft in their asses. Dante says he weeps too, to see the image of the divine twisted in such a way. And if the image of the devil with one nostril is upsetting enough in itself, the way it is described is supposed to make it worse, increasing our sense of foreboding. Let's return to this description, which is startlingly economical for the vividness in which I think it produces. Middle English manuscripts have minimal punctuation, so my guess here is that this passage would be written as one continuous sentence. Despite its economy, the Cloud author is deliberate in his slow movement through it. The devil has one nostril, o nosfero. Spelling is variable in the Middle Ages with no standardization, yet I still think this is an interesting variation of the word, perhaps deliberately archaic, because the Cloud author's nostero keeps the Old English form of hole. That's what your nostrils are, your nose holes. The word itself is somewhat askew here, and its oddity is further specified, more linguistic. If it stops us in our reading tracks at one nostril, then great and wide allows us to pause and in awe consider further. The devil will gladly cast it up, a definitive action descriptively rendered so the vision up into the brain that follows is easily conjured in the mind's eye. It's almost cinematic, with the therat in the middle of the clause causing us to dwell once again in the nostril. The repetition of brain in the final sentence presents us with a chiastic structure that turns on the fire of hell and fiend, which the Cloud author wants us to think of as synonyms anyways. What else can the fiend's brain be composed of, he asks, assuming their identity. The description is short but paced in such a way, with repetition and pauses, that the true shock of the scene is methodically revealed. These effects work together as the horror is produced out of the slow and steady realization of the alterations made to the familiar, at once divine and worldly image. And so the image as a terrifying revelation brings us back finally then to a consideration between horror and knowledge. The Cloud author is unambiguous about where he stands on the matter. We are meant to subsist in the cloud of unknowing, whose only qualifier is dark and in which it is difficult to remain. Difficult, but not frightening. Persisting in the cloud of unknowing is hard work because of the mind's tendency to fill our thoughts with images, because of our imagination's capacity to run wild. But that is merely a problem of an unquiet mind. What the devil with one nostril shows us is that it is not the unknown that is frightening, but the known. And not only that, it is the things that we know most intimately that should scare us the most. Part of what makes the image of the devil so vivid and so frightening is that it makes use of the body, and the body itself has the capacity to lead us astray. From at least Peter Abelard in the 12th century, the three classical incitements to sin have been formulated as the world, the flesh, and the devil. The Cloud of Unknowing's devil with one nostril, interrupting our meditation and causing us to be a busybody to other monks in the cloister, reminds us that those three sources of temptation are more or less the same thing. And it's not merely the body that is at issue here, but more specifically the face and the mind, those things that are most intensely identified with the self, those aspects of our being that seem most like us. We both know them with the seeming immediacy, and we don't know them as well as we think. We use the component parts of our faces to take in sensory impressions, but we cannot see our own eyes or up our own nostrils without the mediating presence of a mirror, which often in the Middle Ages had severely distorting effects. That we seem to know our own mind but often don't is a familiar sentiment to any of us living in the world after the advent of psychoanalysis, but it's a well-known aspect of experience for medieval thinkers too. One of Augustine's confessions is that, quote, "I have become a question to myself." The intellectual sympathies between St. Augustine and Sigmund Freud allow me to end where I began, with a consideration of Lovecraft's dictum and what it says about not fear as such, but fear in modernity. Lovecraft's assessment seems Freudian to me, but less the Freud of the interpretation of dreams and more the Freud of civilization and its discontents. It's more like the Freud of the late writings, practicing a kind of speculative anthropology. While the situation being discussed here is vague, Lovecraft explains that, quote, "the unknown, being likewise the unpredictable, becomes for our primitive forefathers a terrible and omnipotent source of boons and calamities visited upon mankind for cryptic and wholly extraterrestrial reasons, and thus clearly belong to spheres of existence whereof we know nothing and wherein we have no part." The primitive qualifier is important here because he's imagining, I think, our prehistoric ancestors responding to things like disease or terrible and sudden storms, or really anything in the night that waits just barely visible at the edge of the fire's light. These, our forefathers' frights, are why he calls this sort of fear the oldest. But left unsaid there is that for Lovecraft, it is also one of the most recent fears as well. Thinking of this judgment in its own historical moment lets us see it in a new light. Lovecraft himself was fond of the descriptor, quote-unquote, non-Euclidean geometry to describe his unknown and unthinkable ancient gods, making use of an upheaval to the foundations of mathematics that was popularized in the mid-19th century, but further upheavals followed. Closer to the publication and writing of his own essay, we have Einstein's relativity, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, Gödel's incompleteness theorem, the overturning of whole fields of knowledge. And that is why I think we need to understand Lovecraft's judgment as symptomatic of modernity. The belief that the world is and should be fully knowable is a result of what the German philosopher Hans Blumenberg calls the genesis of the Copernican world, a product of our own self-assertion and myth-making that paradoxically denies any mythic act, an untenable and unsustainable confidence that all questions are available to be answers. Lovecraft's fear of the unknown is a response to modernity's epistemological hubris meeting its own limitations. For the Middle Ages, the unknown wasn't necessarily frightening, but was the experience of the divine that subtends and gives meaning to our world. Now we see but through a glass darkly, and it is only then, after this world, that we will see face to face. For the Middle Ages, our experience of this world is an experience of the unknown, and that is comforting, a sign of divine omnipotence and omniscience. It is only in a modernity that assumes instead that we should be omnipotent and omniscient that the unknown becomes something truly horrific. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Perry, for that insightful talk, lecture. I actually have already read this as a text document, and hearing you speak about it and bring these concepts to life was more entertaining, and thank you very much. I just want to preface this before I begin asking questions, and thank you also to everybody for attending. By saying that the Cloud of Unknowing would be an appropriate descriptor for my knowledge of the medieval period. And the horror part I have a little bit more awareness of. So I think that I'm going to begin with my questions with that dastardly H.P. Lovecraft. And then when I ask members of the audience for their input and for their questions, perhaps some classicists or medievalists will be able to discuss those concepts. I'm working within my wheelhouse here. But that was a fascinating discussion. I love the imagery of the fiend, the arch-fiend, very evocative, and some of my references are going to be cinematic of something from like a Guillermo del Toro film, right? Something in which the body is corrupted, and the familiar is, what's the word I'm looking for? The familiar is perverted by some disfiguration. And yeah, sorry, I just lost my track of thought there. Firstly, yes, H.P. Lovecraft. I just want to ask, is it kind of, I don't know if anybody else thought this, but there's a sort of ironic, or perhaps not ironic, but I found it fascinating that talking about this apophatic, I believe, this apophatic, contemplative, this need to attempt to access the inaccessible, the ineffable God being or whatever, that is essentially unrepresentable. It seemed to me that it's evocative of the elder gods and Lovecraft's fear of the cosmos. Closer, oh, okay, sorry. And so ultimately, just to like, trying to get to at the end, this was a positive thing from the point of view of the Cloud author, the being in this contemplative state, this lack of understanding, opening yourself, voiding yourself of self. Whereas for Lovecraft, it is terror-inducing. So, I believe you may have mentioned this in your summarization, but is this more indicative of of Lovecraft's social context being in the early 20th century, rather, sorry, excuse me. Sorry, I'm slightly nervous. As can be seen. And of course, these are like completely wildly different social contexts, but there's something interesting, right, about that, about the fact that Lovecraft is talking in a kind of, even though he's talking about these, he himself was a non-believer in religion, he's talking in terms of that sound religious and about this cosmic entity. Could you comment on that? Perhaps the sort of about Lovecraft's descriptions that I suppose secular attempts to confront this unknowability. I don't know how we're going to work this.
Why don't you do another question and then I'll respond to that.
Oh, okay. The bodily transgressions and the images of the image of the fiend with his nostril distorted, it made me, I'm a lover of body horror cinema, body horror literature, and I wanted to also comment on that, and like the body is the constant through these things, from the Cloud of Unknowing to these, to contemporary horror, whatever changes there may be in ideological beliefs, the body seems to be the constant, despite whatever there may be changing meanings attached to it, but it seems that the body is the site of meaning generation. I think of things like Reagan's slow degeneration in The Exorcist, and her body becomes the site of these ancient forces intruding into the secular world. And I think I would like, if you could think, perhaps offer some more contemporary examples. I know, again, that we're talking about medieval horror, but some more contemporary examples of that kind of figuration. And one more thing I wanted to note was that the apophatic, this description of the need to empty oneself, there's this discussion, it's mentioned that that mankind's, human beings' words and our images are incapable of expressing this, and figuration should not be attempted, right? And then we get this incredible image of the beast fiend, right? This incredible metaphorical, this use of bold language, and this, we can see this fire in this up through the nostrils, almost like a cinematic point of view shot that we're coming up underneath. And I just wanted to clarify that is also because this is the fiend we're talking about and not the divine, right? So I suppose the devil becomes a sin eater for our pesky imaginations and where they can take us. Yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Jethro, for those questions. So to make sure I have them down, the first one is about kind of Lovecraft's secular kind of notions of the divine, or what that looks like from a point of view of modernity, the kind of like horror of the divine if you're not a believer, right? The second one is about, the third one is about the devil with one nostril as the second one's about the body as a site of generation of meaning, and then and what that produces, and then the third one is the devil with one nostril is actually a very vivid image, so doesn't, like, why is an apophatic writer writing about that? So to go in order, I'm gonna put this down, I'm like doing a juggling act up here. Lovecraft's, I mean, it is interesting, right? Like, as I was saying, this question about, like, how we respond to unknowingness in a kind of contemporary context, especially a kind of secular contemporary context. I think we can think about this in relationship to maybe a couple of different kind of like classical moments of modernity, right? And in part, I should say, this is spurred by a conversation Jethro and I have already had on the way over here about other kinds of related notions, but I'm thinking here of the Romantic sublime and maybe more specifically the Kantian sublime, right? And so one of the things that Kant does as a kind of like paradigmatic figure of modernity, one of the reasons Kant gets called the all-destroyer, which is a badass nickname, is he rules all of these things outside of the bounds of knowledge, right, including the divine. But then in the third critique, you start getting peaks of these things that have been ruled out come flooding back in a certain kind of way, right? Later in that text, the teleological judgments of nature get you back to some sort of version of the sublime, or of the divine. But the sublime gives you this kind of like awe and terror that is supposed to be secularized, but was always part of the religious experience of the divine as well, right? A contemporary account to the Cloud author is a treatise called On the Dread Love of God, right? That the love of the divine is a kind of fear-inspiring as well, in part because it's so overwhelming and also unknowable, right? And so I think of that as, indications of, following someone like Saba Mahmood and other thinkers, right? We haven't really purged the religious from the contemporary or the modernity as much as some of us might like to think, right? That there is this kind of vestige of religion and belief that is always kind of haunting the edges. And so that's what I kind of think of there, is that like that energy, that fear has to go somewhere, especially because it is, I mean, one of the things that I am interested in is the relationship between horror and a genre like tragedy, right? Because in both cases, what they're dealing with is the experience of contingency. What is it that we do or we think when faced with the fact that the world can do any terrible thing to us? How do we represent that? How do we overcome it? How do we take control over it, right? And so that's what, in some ways, they're both wrestling with, which takes me to the body, right? Because that experience of contingency and the way that contingency impinges on the body is, I think, what everyone is dealing with there in that kind of trans-historical, horrific mode, right? The fact that the body is massively fragile, right? That we have this sense in which, like, we are imminently woundable is something that I think makes horror kind of trans-historically locatable, right? The fact that you can't just put it in any kind of specific historical context. Of course, history will change as you move, its expression will change as you move through history, but the fact that something can always kill you, right, is a kind of like baseline out of which we are operating, which is always going to produce a kind of horror. And then finally, this question of, I lost it there. Remind me the third one? The vividness of the devil. I think that part of that is the fact that, I mean, you see this pop up every once in a while in these different figures associated with mysticism. Like, there is this strong drive towards negation, but the fact of the matter is that several of them are very good writers, and I think that they just like let it get away from them to a certain kind of extent. Of course, he can do that with the case of the devil because it proves his point, right? The vividness of the devil is what your mind is going to produce anyway when left to its own devices. All of those different castles that you will build on the air are different figurations of the devil with one nostril anyway. So he can produce a vivid example in that instance. Whereas when he's dealing with the divine, right, he needs to go with something much, much more vague. What's particularly interesting in some of these things is some of the, I should have included a picture, but some of the manuscripts, not of the Cloud of Unknowing, but of some of the others, are illuminated, and it becomes then, you know, the responsibility of the artist, the visual artist, to produce an example of an apophatic divine image. And usually what they do is they just go in the way of geometry, right? So Dante, when eventually he sees God, we see circles within circles as a kind of like impossible imagination. And that's what they try to basically do. We get these abstract, they're really, really abstract. It's almost like color field stuff, where they know that they're not supposed to produce something that looks divine, which is really wild in the first place, right? Because the entirety of Christianity is built on the idea that the divine becomes human in the first place, right? So like, you could just produce Jesus, that would be fine, right? Like, that's licit. But instead they go really, really abstract. And so there's an internal tension there just between, I think, the dictates of artistic production and the kind of like impulse towards divine meditative practice. So I think we are opening the floor to questions now, right? I think we have a microphone coming around.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much. That was very, very interesting. The Cloud of Unknowing, I don't think I've ever heard a better explanation for faith. I kept thinking that is such a good description of why people hang on to that frame of mind. It's something that's, it's an anathema to me, because I always look at it as, why would you want to live in a condition of faith? But your description of it made it so much sense out of it. Just a thought of, does the idea of faith tie into, or do you think it is somehow related to the metaphysics of the Cloud of Unknowing? Does that make sense to you, that it should go there for me?
Oh, good, this is working. Speaking of the Cloud of Unknowing, that's what technology is. Yeah, I think that it matters immensely, right? That what we're getting is not only a certain kind of faith, but a certain kind of extremity of faith, right? And, you know, it's one of those, the Middle Ages produces such different modalities of living and faith, and what those, and attendant kinds of organizations of knowledge that are, that accompany those different modalities. And so I'm thinking here specifically, I think it matters very much that the Cloud of Unknowing is produced in a Carthusian charter house, because if you think about the extreme way that those people are living anyway, you know, they're not supposed to be talking to anyone except for an hour a week. It is incredibly isolating. Usually you have to convince the Catholic Church that you're ready for this. You have to be another kind of monk first, because they're like, that'll make people go crazy and it doesn't look good for us to have these like Carthusians that are mad, like wandering the streets. So they test you out in other forms of monasticism before they'll let you do this. And so, but if you think about them alone in their cells, especially fast days where, you know, they're drinking beer kind of all day, but they're not eating, like, it's going to produce some really kind of like wild moments, right? To like, not to degrade their experience, right? But it's really like produce, you know, it's a kind of powder keg for some really different kind of visual and mental kind of acrobatics, right? And so I think that version of what that faith looks like is a specialized version of what a lot of them would understand faith to be anyways. I think here there's an excellent essay by this guy named Stephen Justice called Did the Middle Ages Believe in Their Miracles? Based off of a famous classicist essay, right? Did the Romans believe in their gods? And the answer that he gives is yes, but like not the way that we tend to mean it, right? They really are after a kind of testing of the faith, right? That a faith untested is not worthwhile, right? And so what is so interesting to me about the Cloud of Unknowing, and I should say that like where this essay will end up, I think is in a Festra for Steve. So like he's very much on my mind here. But what the Cloud of Unknowing shows us is the fact that that testing, right, is actually just part of everyday experience. Your mind can't focus on the divine all of the time, right? Like that's even something that he builds in to the discussion of the practice with his ghostly friend. He says that you will approach this, but even if you have the kind of ecstatic union, you'll fall away from it, right? And then you have all of these attendant feelings of desire, of despair, of other kinds of negative emotions for not being able to subsist always in this cloud of unknowing because it is so extreme. But it gives you a figure of what your faith can be. Is that, yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions? Okay, let me just I'll work my way back.
Oh, me already? Oh, down here, please. Is there a question? No.
I don't know.
I would like to preface this by saying that I haven't really taken English since high school, so I'm not too tuned into the finer points of Middle English philosophy, but I do just have some questions regarding the manifestation of religion based on the kind of extenuating historical circumstances at the time.
Yeah.
Because I remember looking at the fall of the Roman Empire. One of my classics lecturers mentioned offhandedly the existence of mystery cults as manifestations of a very, very bizarre social time where a lot of people kind of went a little bit off the rails, and to cope with what was going on around them, they kind of turned to more like freaky things, to put it in a very non-academic sense. But if you could look at the kind of this sort of medieval English fear of the known, as you put it, this kind of fear of the flesh as the flesh being what they were most intimately familiar with. Because if you are a peasant, I mean, frankly, you're not really going to be sitting there in the field hoeing and thinking about the finer points of philosophy. Most of what you know is centered around your body, the pain that you feel, and then whatever you experience physically, as opposed to the kind of mental awareness that the society at large has today. So could you look at this as, if you were, I'm sorry, I'm not articulating this very well, but in comparison to the modern fear of the unknown. Could you look at that as just a manifestation of the different amounts of information and knowledge available? Because if they found peace in the unknown, in that kind of cloud scenario, because they didn't know anything else, that's, I mean, I'll be honest, what were they thinking about? Like, they didn't have the brain poison that is like Twitter or something, like.
Right.
To their credit.
You know, which is brain poison. So, you know, there's a couple of different distinctions that I want to draw. One is that, so as I was saying, this is like not, I mean, we have a kind of, as medievalists, we have this knee-jerk reaction where the number of surviving manuscripts supposedly tell us how popular a text was. And so we have a lot of these, relatively speaking, but I don't think it's not supposed to be popular because regular people aren't supposed to be looking at this, right? And so it's emphatically not for the peasants. And this is a time in which that occasioned a great deal of controversy, right? And we can think about that both in terms of England, which was in the midst of its own homegrown heresy, which eventually becomes the Protestant Reformation. Wycliffism, where John Wycliffe was saying things like, oh, that piece of bread that the priest is holding, that just signifies God, it's not actually God. Those types of things, right? So it becomes the Protestant Reformation, but they start burning people, right? And the main, in England in 1402, and the main problem, right, is that Wycliffism is also a translation program. So it's trying to make the Bible available. It's the first Bible that's available in English, and so they're trying to make allow everyone to have access to the divine word. And this causes great anxiety and consternation amongst the ruling elites, in part because, I mean, you can kind of get where they're coming from, because not one generation removed, in 1382, we have the Great Peasants' Revolt, where the peasants storm the Tower of London, they cut off the head of the Archbishop of Canterbury, they get rid of feudalism for a week. So it's a quite unstable time, and so this question about like who are you saying to what, to whom, and in what language, is a deeply, deeply politicized point. And so, you know, this is written in English, which in and of itself has the capacity to produce anxiety, but I think that one of the ways you get out of it is that it stays within the Charter House to other incredibly learned monks who are just spending all day reading and writing, right? You can think about other figures. On the continent, for instance, you have all of these other figures associated with mysticism who get in trouble for saying things like Meister Eckhart or Julian of Norwich, who are like, blessed are your sins, because those come from God too. Julian gets out of trouble because she's an anchorite, so she's like walled up in a cell on the side of a church. And then Meister Eckhart gets condemned for heresy and has the good sense to die before they can burn him. But I mean, Wycliffe, right, that didn't, you know, he died, but then they dug up his bone. He dies in 1384, and then they dig up his bones in 1427 and try them for heresy and burn them. So it's no, you know, you can still get in trouble for telling the peasants about this stuff. So I think there's an important class distinction there that is in operation. You have a follow-up? Yeah.
So could you kind of look at those small pockets of people who are very almost divorced from what is going on in the rest of the country? If I were to continue with that comparison to the mystery cults around the fall of the Roman Empire, and even like the crazy conspiracy theorists that we see today.
Well, what's interesting, right, about the Peasants' Revolt, for instance, is that when they do cut off the head of the Archbishop of Canterbury, they reenact the site of the crucifixion on Golgotha with other heads, and they put him in the role of the unsaved thief, because for them he was stealing money that should be going to the poor. So what that shows us is that even the peasantry actually has a really sophisticated signifying system that is imbued with this religious language that they're getting because they're enjoined to yearly confession. They have to go in that's the point of education for them, right? And so I think that one of the important things to keep in mind is that it's true that we know more stuff than they do. We have access to more stuff, although with the conspiracy theory that doesn't always serve us well. It doesn't mean though that that they are unsophisticated in any way. And indeed they have their own kind of ways of responding to things. Part of our problem though is that we have very limited access just in terms of what survives in the written record to what those people are thinking and doing. We have these juridical accounts about them killing people, but that's where we have to read that knowledge out of.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Hi, amazing talk, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
But I seem to be confused by one thing. Towards the end, the author speaks of rather having the fear of the unknown, we should have the fear of the known. I'm having a very hard time trying to understand why would he say something like that. Because to me, the fear of the unknown is very understandable. It's you're walking into dark waters, it's a dark room, you don't know what you're stepping into. But the fear of the known is the fear of the known. Why would he say something like that?
Yeah, that is, perhaps I glanced too quickly at that, and that's my medievalist reflex happening there. But the issue is that the body is the site of the most intimately known, right? We know stuff through our body, through our senses, but that's also how you get to sin, right? And what's tricky about it is that, one, it's the only access you have to the outside world, so of course it's going to be fine in some ways, right? I mean, it will also lead you to salvation, but it's tricky, right? Our bodies are, and they can lead us down paths that will end up in our damnation without us actually knowing about it, right? Or thinking about it or realizing it. And so that's what he's trying to inculcate really is a kind of fear or remind you really of the fact that you should be scared of these impulses, right? Because that is what can happen to you at the end, right? Medieval Christians are often told to dwell on the four last things: death, judgment, heaven, and hell, right? And so that modality of going through the world, I think, discloses to you exactly what should be frightening about the body and the body's inclinations at that point. Does that make sense? Cool.
Anyone else have any questions?
Almost sat on the floor. So yeah, thanks, Prof. Perry, for that. It was very interesting. If I may step out of the English aspect of things and sort of run into the critical theory of things.
Sure.
I think it's underestimated the role of the unknown just in the development of society, sort of leaving the Middle Ages, Renaissance, and then the Enlightenment, and you have this domination that then arises out of trying to control the unknown. Something that, sort of a very Adorno, Horkheimer dialectic of enlightenment thing to say. Yeah. However, speaking of fear in modernity, specifically fear of the unknown in modernity, do you think that from a critical theory perspective, this urge to kind of understand the unknown in modernity would maybe result in a different form of domination, just as Adorno and Horkheimer kind of alluded to in dialectics of enlightenment, and the importance of just the fear of the unknown to sort of drive society? If you have any comments on that, I'd be interested too. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that'll really allow me to speak off the cuff about really broad issues. Yeah, no, I think that that's why I wanted to think, and probably I'll think more with Blumenberg, right? He's a writer of these massive texts, right? Like that's one of his 3 different 800-page volumes, right? So the Genesis of the Copernican World is about that kind of beginning of scientific rationality, right? Which Adorno and Horkheimer will diagnose as a kind of part and parcel of the problem of the Enlightenment. And I think one of the reasons that I can, have this kind of or that we can have this kind of vantage point on modernity is not only the way that the Middle Ages stands against modernity, and so it gives you a vantage point from which to think about modernity, but rather than being in the midst of it, but also because in some ways we are on the other side of part of that scientific rationality, and we have a stronger sense, especially in things like domination over nature, about our own kind of limitations and our own kind of damage that rationality has wrought, right? Although we still see it in all kinds of ways where people are wanting a kind of technological fix out of the problem of global climate change and so on and so forth. So there's still very much a live kind of sense of that rationality. But what's interesting about the Middle Ages, and especially the Cloud author's point in it, is that he's a contemporary. What's going on in philosophy at the time that he's writing, his contemporaries at Oxford at Merton College are the so-called Merton calculators, who are people who are beginning what becomes the scientific revolution, right? So they're applying Aristotelian ideas and logic and scholastic thinking to physical, natural events, right? And that is the birth out of that is what gives us the kind of scientific method, right? And so I think he's seen, a kind of beginnings of that scientific rationality, and he's writing in opposition to it, right? At the same time, and being actually, you all are still on this project of scholasticism, which is to make the entire world knowable, something like the Summa Theologica as its major production, right? And he's that's not the corner we should be turning, right? That this is only going to lead to pain and suffering. And so, as I said, I think that we see someone at the very beginnings have that reaction, and I think we are now suited to have a sense of our own kind of reaction to look back at that notion of progress, right? Although, as I said, go to Silicon Valley and half those dudes are not going to recognize that as a problem, right?
If there's nobody else who wants to ask a question, Dr. Rustin asked, Nambushle asked me to,
Okay, this is more of a comment from my brain, which works intertextually, and so please correct me if I'm misunderstanding anything. But when I was listening to your talk, a lot of the concepts you mentioned kind of resonated with Eastern philosophy, and I mentioned this to you earlier. But the idea of the perfect soul and someone who's in the cloud of unknowing and reaching this the highest contemplative state. To the point where you receiving these ecstatic visions of the divine and stuff, it kind of reminded me of this concept of moksha, or divine bliss and liberation from reality, and the idea of practicing non-attachment, but where the temptation comes from material things rather than sin. Yeah. And also the idea of the inflamed brain. Reminded me of this concept of the monkey mind, which is just jumping from one thing to another and is involved in the self, and it needs to be quieted through meditation. And also the idea of the face and the nose representing the self. And then in contrast to that, being in the cloud would be a negation or surrendering the ego, kind of again, which is very much one of the main points of like Eastern philosophy and Hinduism and stuff. So, and getting rid of like personal conceits. So, and you mentioned Dionysus and the Syrian influence. So I just wanted to see if there is any, if you did come across any kind of links in your work.
Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, I think, there is a kind of, you were pointing to at the end there a kind of potential shared inheritance. We still aren't totally sure, in part because it's been obscured, that person's identity, for so long, the pseudo-Dionysius. But what we think about him is that he's a 6th century Syrian monk. And so he's right at a kind of, and that's an important point because 6th century Syria, right, is where it's next door to Constantinople. It's where the Romans have kind of retreated to. So you have the Eastern Roman Empire, right, which becomes the Byzantians. And then you have like that in relationship to India and the Silk Road and the spice trade, right? And so that's not only goods, but ideas are moving back and forth there. And so we think that the pseudo-Dionysius is absorbing some of these Eastern philosophies and Christianizing them, right? And then what happens is that that gets wedded to stuff that already is a little bit influenced by Eastern stuff anyway, from Alexandria, which is the Neoplatonic tradition. And so, which goes into Christianity from Augustine. And so you get these two major thinkers of Christianity that then, like, that impulse just shoots everywhere. And some of the other people that I wasn't talking about are even better kind of examples. Like you can, again, Meister Eckhart, who I mentioned just a little bit ago, talks about annihilating the soul so that you can get the divine, right? And so that like extremity is even closer to kind of Eastern practices. Yeah. And so that I think is important. Although interestingly, it's even important on the other side of like, the more rationalist side of things. Like if you look at Aquinas' Summa Theologica, the figure who gets cited the third most often, it's like Paul, St. Augustine, and then the pseudo-Dionysius. So even within the kind of rationalist core of medieval Christianity, you have this kind of Neoplatonic spiritualism that is deeply sympathetic to those kind of modalities.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody else, everybody on the floor here, all the audience, everybody for coming today. I wanted to say thank you, Prof. Perry. Thank you so much for opening your single nostril for us. I think that Cloud Author is busy on his cloud up in heaven right now, cursing you. Because if the devil is all knowledge inside the brain, I think you have opened our nostrils today and made us all climb inside there. Thank you. And I want to say a big thank you to the Dean, Prof. Hlongwa, and to the DVC. I'm not sure if perhaps somewhere out on the stream over there, our digital stream, is listening. And a big thank you to them and to Prof. Maik Nosu, who might also be out there on the digital stream. All of these people, all of our leaders who have managed to create this wonderful opportunity for us to exchange and share knowledge. It's been wonderful, really. This is a wonderful culmination of this moment, and I hope that this exchange will just grow and bear fruit and create more single nostrils for us. I can't let go of that thing. But I wanted to quickly hand over for a very personal, very deep, profound gratitude from the honours class that have had the closest interaction with you. So here are our English honours students, or two representatives from the class, to come and say thank you. Oh yes, sorry, and from us, on behalf of us. Okay.
Oh,
On
thank you.
behalf of the School of Arts, the College of Humanities, the English Department, all of us here, a very, very big thank you.
Oh, it's
A chalice.
a chalice and a blanket. Thank you very much.
When you are contemplating. Okay. And over to Tatum, thanks.
I haven't graded their papers yet, so I understand this to be a bribe.
It's certainly a bribe. On behalf of the English honor students, we say a sincere goodbye to you, Prof. Perry. It truly has been a pleasure to hear you speak today and to experience your vast knowledge in our seminars. When you first asked us about our experience with philosophy, you were met with many, guys, we don't know what's going on. We really didn't know what we were getting into when we started, but we appreciate your kindness, respect, and your approachable way of bringing the topics to us. I know I have certainly learned new things from you during our critical theory seminars. We will miss your jokes that you cracked all the time and how you tried to make the most outlandish content seem relatable. I love seeing your openness to learning new things about South Africa, especially with how you dealt with your initiation into South Africa. By that I mean load shedding. You actually went above and beyond to follow our local politics by reading the public's comments on the Eskom app, and you managed to philosophize your experience and relate it to our Marx content. You could say that you brought light into the darkness, or a cloud into the darkness. The content that was taught was a mixed bag indeed. You could even say it was as mixed as a Durban curry or biryani pots, filled with many spices and ingredients. You brought flavor into our lives by introducing us English honors to 17th to 20th century philosophers like Kant and Adorno, as well as bringing us into the contemporary space with philosophers such as Mbembe and Nye. Overall, you chose a great recipe to introduce us to critical theory. It was a delicious and filling meal, maybe a little bit challenging to eat. To sweeten the pot, you took part in the life of UKZN by attending the philosophy department's philosophy society meetings. You were able to easily go on intelligent yet calm rants and add humor into them as well. If I could take away one lesson, although you have taught me many, it is keep injecting life into the past and make it relevant for today. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. You all have been a real treat.
There's a lot in there. So that's a UKZN golf shirt. And I know you love blue.
Look at, there's all kinds of goodies in here. Candy, great.
Candy.
And then I want to stop philosophizing, but I can't, which is great. Yeah, thank you all. I think that's it.
You're
Yes,
okay.
thanks.
Yes.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you everybody. And especially a special thank you to Rakshika for organizing all of this, the venue, and the eats, and the sound, and the streaming. So please join us afterwards for some lovely refreshments. Thank you.
Thank you. Group photo.